Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Carrie Abrams, Dean of the Duke University School of Law. We come together this evening to honor the life of an extraordinary person, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Nearly 2 weeks ago, the day after we all received the terrible news that Justice Ginsburg had passed away due to cancer, I received a message from Nia Gavin and Christine Mullen, the current and past presidents of the Women's Law Students Association here at Duke. They wanted to know what we could do to honor Justice Ginsburg and share our perspectives and experiences with the Duke community. The event you are experiencing tonight is the result of their vision and dedication. Tonight you will hear from a variety of faculty and alumni of Duke Law School. Although each of their stories is different, I think that one thing the speakers tonight share is a sense that Justice Ginsburg shaped the lives not only of those who were close to her, but of millions of others, whether they knew it or not. Each of us has experienced her contributions in different ways, depending on who we are, when we were born, and what we've done in our lives. Here's my personal example. I was born in 1971. I know that for some students, that may seem like a very long time ago, but it's really not. It's less than half a century. In 1971, a working woman who became pregnant sometimes had only two options: get an abortion or be fired. In 1971, women could be and were routinely omitted from jury pools. In 1971, some colleges and universities could refuse admission to women. In 1971, there was no law of sexual harassment. In 1971, 1% of federal judges were women. For comparison, that figure is now 33%. In 1971, 98 people had served as United States Supreme Court justices since our country's founding, and not a single one of them was a woman. Now, there have been 114 people to have served, and 4 have been women. So what changed between 1971 and now? Many things, of course. A robust feminist movement, many pieces of federal legislation, dramatic social change. But one thing that happened was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. In 1971, the Supreme Court held in Reed versus Reed that discrimination based on gender is unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. The 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868 after the Civil War and included a guarantee that the government could not deprive any person the equal protection of the law. It took the Supreme Court until 1971 to understand that a person could be a woman. That understanding was the result of the extraordinary lawyering done by Ruth Bader Ginsburg as counsel to the ACLU in that case. Over the next few years, Ginsburg litigated numerous other Supreme Court cases that dismantled the structures that had made legal distinctions between men and women and what they could do. Later, as a justice, she continued this work through cases such as United States versus Virginia, decided in 1996, during my first year of law school. In that case, in an opinion authored by Justice Ginsburg, the court held unconstitutional, under the Equal Protection Clause, the Virginia Military Institute's male-only admissions policy. One thing you may notice here is a long gap in dates. The world didn't completely change with Reed versus Reed. By 1996, there were still questions about when distinctions made on the basis of sex or gender are legally permissible. And of course, those conversations continue today. The legal arguments made by advocates in the transgender rights movement, for example, flow directly from the arguments that Justice Ginsburg made in cases where she was focused on cisgender men and women. 4 years ago, I drove up to Washington, D.C. to attend the oral argument at the Supreme Court in a case, Sessions versus Morales-Santana, for which I had authored an amicus brief. Once again, the case was about gender discrimination, this time regarding a law that gave citizenship by birth to the foreign-born children of US citizen mothers, but denied citizenship if the child's parent was a father. The case happened to be argued the day after the 2016 presidential election. I woke up early to walk from a friend's house to the court. DC seemed like a ghost town, and for once the Supreme Court was almost empty. But Justice Ginsburg was on fire during oral argument, and I was not surprised when months later the court's opinion striking down the statute as unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause was published, and she was the author. The statute, she explained, reflected an era when the law books of our nation were rife with overbroad generalizations about the way men and women are. If there's a message I have for all of you tonight, it's that although Justice Ginsburg helped to radically transform those law books and to move us towards a society when we do not allow the law to treat men and women differently based on those overbroad generalizations, we are not so far from that day. 1971 is not very long ago. Neither is 1996, and neither is 2016. If we are to uphold Justice Ginsburg's legacy and continue to allow women, men, and people of all genders the liberty to lead the lives they want to lead, we will need to be as persistent and as prepared and as engaged as Justice Ginsburg was right up until the end. Thank you all for coming tonight. Now I would like to ask Christine Mullen of the Women's Law Student Association to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Dean Abrams, and thank you to all of our attendees. As you will continue to hear throughout our evening, Justice Ginsburg led a life and career that are inspiring and motivating for many of us inside and outside the law. She shattered glass ceiling after glass ceiling and never stopped fighting for us. It is an honor to honor her. It's my pleasure to introduce, by order of appearance, our impressive participants for tonight's evening. These individuals have had or are embarking on careers that law students aspire to, and while I could speak about their accomplishments at length, I will try to provide some highlights for the purposes of this event. Professor Neil Siegel is an expert in constitutional law. Professor Siegel served as a clerk to the justice during the 2003 to 2004 term and remained close with her since that time. He hosted an annual event with her during the DC Summer Institute on Law and Policy, which he directs. I've been lucky enough to be a student of Professor Siegel's twice now, and my education has been deeply enriched by learning from someone who learned from and worked so closely with Justice Ginsburg. Dean Kate Bartlett was the dean of the law school from 2000 to 2007 and is often credited with cementing Duke among top law schools. Among many other accomplishments, Dean Bartlett is a leading scholar in the areas of gender law and feminist legal theory. Professor Walter Dellinger is a partner at O'Melveny and Myers and has served as an assistant attorney general, head of the Office of Legal Counsel, and even as acting dean of Duke Law School. He has served as acting solicitor general for the 1996 to 1997 term, during which he litigated extensively in front of Justice Ginsburg. Michael Dreeben, Duke Law class of 1981, is also a partner at O'Melveny and Myers and has led an impressive career, including more than 30 years serving in the Office of the Solicitor General, 24 of which were spent as the Deputy Solicitor General in charge of the government's criminal docket in the Supreme Court. He has argued more than 100 cases in the Supreme Court, also making him a frequent visitor to Justice Ginsburg's bench. Professor Maggie Lemos, the Senior Associate Dean of Duke Law School, is an expert in civil procedure, legislation, and statutory interpretation. She also teaches and writes about legal institutions and judicial decision-making. Professor Lemos clerked for the Supreme Court, clerking for Justice John Paul Stevens during the same term that Professor Siegel clerked for Justice Ginsburg. Farah Berra, Duke Law class of 2020, was editor-in-chief for volume 69 of Duke Law Journal. Farah organized a Women in the Law joint issue and conference among the top 16 law schools, celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment and the fact that all flagship journals at these schools had female editors-in-chief for the first time ever. Justice Ginsburg was a guest of honor at this conference. Professor Lisa Kern Griffin is a leading scholar in evidence and criminal procedure law and was an assistant U.S. attorney. Professor Griffin clerked for the first female Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor, during the 1997 to 1998 term, while she sat on the bench with Justice Ginsburg. It is my pleasure to turn it over to Professor Siegel.
Thank you very much, Christine. I am proud to call you and Naya my students. I want to begin by thanking my students past and present, going back to my first year at Duke Law School. My last day with Justice Ginsburg was my first year at Duke. I want to thank my colleagues as well for participating in this event, attending it, and for your overwhelming outpouring of support since the news of Justice Ginsburg's passing went public. I am grateful, and it has helped to sustain me during a very difficult time. For Justice Ginsburg, it was primarily about the work, right? Almost always entirely about the work. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't begin by saying a few words about the work to which she devoted her life. And then I'll say a few words about what she looked like up close. So for Justice Ginsburg, a primary purpose of the Constitution was to include within its embrace, slowly but surely over time, groups of people who traditionally did not count or count for much in constituting we the people in whose name the Constitution purports to speak. She called this commitment equal citizenship stature, and it tied together her jurisprudence in different areas of the law, not just gender, but race, disability, sexual orientation, transgender status, federalism, including federal power, as well as the appropriate roles of the states in the federal system. She was committed to equal citizenship stature. In this way, she thought that the purpose of the Constitution was to create a more perfect union, which is what the preamble says, a union that will become more perfect over time. Now, I think it's important to understand what she meant by equal, what she meant by equality, because she has long been misunderstood by both her critics and her admirers. In fact, she was misunderstood as recently as last week in the pages of the New York Times by two of her former law clerks. By equality, she did not mean sameness. She didn't mean treat everyone the same, no disparate treatment. In her view, in a society such as our own, with a history such as our own, it was not enough to simply say, treat everyone the same from now on going forward. She thought that it all depended on the purposes, the effects, the dominant social meanings of governmental action. Sometimes equality meant treating everyone the same, and sometimes it meant treating people differently, taking relevant differences into account. This is exactly what she said in the seminal equal protection sex discrimination case of United States against Virginia in 1996. She said that sex classifications may be used to compensate women for particular economic disabilities they have suffered, to promote equal employment opportunity, to advance full development of the talent and capacities of our nation's people. But such classifications may not be used, as they once were, to create or perpetuate the legal, social, and economic inferiority of women. And she had similar views with respect to other traditionally excluded groups. And this is why she saw clearly as early as 1971 that pregnancy discrimination was a paradigmatic case of sex discrimination, a view she advocated for, and to this day, the Supreme Court has not accepted in its equal protection jurisprudence. It's why she was not hostile to affirmative action and didn't believe the Constitution, properly understood, ought to be. It's why she was concerned about disparate impacts, racial disparate impacts based on gender, that she did not think it was enough for the government to simply have to justify not at all actions it knowingly takes that have significant negative impacts on groups that have traditionally been excluded. In other words, by equality, she meant a commitment to combat group subordination. And I think that is in large part why she speaks to so many people, whether they knew her or not. On a more personal level, when I think about Justice Ginsburg, I think about the reflecting pool in Washington, D.C., between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. Because when you look at the reflecting pool from afar, it seems beautiful, pristine, clear, unblemished. And then if you walk up close, at least at certain times, it can seem quite polluted and dirty even, not what it looks like from afar. And with Justice Ginsburg, what I can share with you from many years of knowing her and caring for her and being cared for by her is that she looked just as good up close. She looked just as good in private. In many ways, she looked better. She would work so hard. It was always about the work for her. It wasn't about her ego. It wasn't about the clerk's ego. It was about getting it right, keeping it tight. She would work late at night into the wee hours of the morning. She would stand up and work at the end of long sittings if she had to make sure that she couldn't fall asleep when there was so much more work to do. Her work ethic was extraordinary. So was her optimism. She had an optimistic outlook on life. I think she would be optimistic now, notwithstanding the many difficulties that our nation faces. She did it in private when no one was looking. She had an optimistic, positive outlook that I think many of us would benefit from emulating in the times in which we're living. She also was as strong as advertised. And I don't mean the push-ups and the famous workouts. I mean real core inner strength, not bravado, right? Not insecurity, masquerading as something else, but the kind of strength that gets a person through the darkest of times, the kind of strength that can be brought to bear to help others get through the darkest of times. She exuded it, and she shared it with her clerks in a way that I think they ended up being stronger as a result. I realize my time is running short, and I'll just mention a couple of more things that I think can speak to all of us. She really cared about words. She cared about language. She thought it was very important to say what one meant and only what one meant, to use words carefully because they have meaning, they have power, to read with care, to speak with care, to understand the impact that words can have on other people, to understand just how powerful they can be. And she taught that, again, to her law clerks, and I think she taught that to anyone who read her opinions. She was focused on making sure that other people could understand what she was saying. She was not focused on using big words or talking in jargon in a way that made it very difficult for the reader or the listener to understand. And the last thing I'll mention is her commitment to being part of something greater than herself, to understanding that life was not just about one's self, life was not just about acquiring wealth if one is so fortunate as to be able to do that. It's about other people, it's about groups who can't fully protect themselves. She didn't just talk the talk, she walked the walk. She devoted her professional life to this. And when she would speak with me at our yearly gatherings with the Duke community in DC, she would always leave the students in the audience with that bit of advice, to have some part of your life and your careers be devoted to public service. And when you're near the end of your days, you'll look back with a greater sense of satisfaction that you've helped other people and left the world a little better than you left it. And the last thing, and now I promise I'll stop, she taught me is, or maybe reminded me of in passing, is that everyone we love, everyone we care about is going to die. We may suppress that knowledge much of the time, but it's true. And I think if we can bear that in mind more of the time as opposed to less, it will help us to focus on what really matters in life. It will help us to distinguish what's relevant from what's irrelevant, how we want to spend our time and how we don't. And I think in passing and in inviting all of us to reflect on her life, she has conveyed that message loudly and clearly one last time, and she has invited the rest of us to follow in her lead.
Thanks, Neil. There can't be much doubt that over the long trajectory of Justice Ginsburg's life as a litigator, scholar, and a judge, she's been the single most important figure in the advancement of gender equality in this country. In terms of her legacy, I take that as a given. I'm going to talk tonight about what I see as the structure of the legal argument she used so successfully. Because I'm going to break down these arguments into separate strands, it's going to sound from time to time as if I'm disagreeing with Professor Siegel. We actually agree on most everything, but it's and not until the end that you may realize where that convergence lies. First, I would say that an important aspect of Justice Ginsburg's advocacy efforts in the 1970s and 80s was the proposition that for all purposes that matter, women are the same as men and thus should be treated the same under the law. Justice Ginsburg dismissed claims about gender difference that were offered as justifications for sex-based classifications as stereotypes about who women are, who men are, and what their proper roles are. That is, stereotypes about women being dependent on men, about men being the primary breadwinners, about women's proper place in the home with children while men operated in the public sphere of paid employment and as citizens. When she was focused on women's sameness to men, Ginsburg preferred to articulate stereotypes not as intentional wrongs, but as misunderstandings or mistakes. Ginsburg herself had helped persuade the court that stereotypes, the kind that she challenged, were an accidental byproduct of a traditional way of thinking about women. This casting of sex inequality as unintentional was very savvy on her part because it allowed people to accept her argument without having to admit that they were sexist. Equally savvy was her practice of challenging rules and practices on behalf of men as well as women. Her theory was that practices that appeared to favor women were based on notions of what she and others called romantic paternalism, which elevated women's unique role in the home and with respect to children and families, but in so doing gave the state an excuse to treat them as weak and dependent and best confined to the private sphere. So advocating for men was good for women as well as for men. So much of the work in establishing sex-based classifications or dismantling sex-based classifications in the 70s and 80s was to expose these stereotypes and show that generalizations about women or men were not true about all women or all men, and thus violated the individual's right to be treated as an individual. The proposition seems obvious today, but it took heroic effort by Ginsburg and other advocates to ingrain this principle into the law. The simple structure of this approach, however, was not always sufficient. This is particularly the case when different treatment of women seemed to be based on real gender differences, like pregnancy. Ginsburg had always argued that treating pregnancy differently from other temporary disabilities amounted to sex discrimination, but as a matter of constitutional law, she never succeeded, and in a number of other areas as well, courts have excused sex-based classifications or exclusions based on perceptions of gender differences. It appeared that might happen in a Supreme Court case challenging the constitutionality of the Virginia Military Institute's refusal to admit women. Dean Abrams and Professor Siegel have already referred to this case. To defend the exclusion of women, the state of Virginia argued that men and women learn differently, that the adversative methods used at VMI, while highly effective for some men, did not work for women, and indeed that the very presence of women would undermine the benefits of those methods for men. The lower courts had accepted these arguments. In her majority opinion for the Supreme Court, Justice Ginsburg not only exposed the inaccuracy of these stereotypes, but she directly confronted the issue of gender difference, stating that even inherent differences between the genders cannot be used as a basis for denying opportunities for women. Sex-based classifications might be acceptable to compensate women for differences or to remedy past discrimination, but not to perpetuate their inferiority. In other words, sex-based classifications can be used to eliminate women's subordination, but not to further it. With this focus on women's subordination in VMI, the assumption that stereotypes are accidental byproducts of traditional ways of thinking seems to disappear. Indeed, Justice Ginsburg calls out Virginia on the disingenuousness of its defense of VMI. In response to Virginia's argument that the lack of educational opportunities for women in Virginia was a historical anomaly, Justice Ginsburg finds in the historical record a deliberate policy on the part of Virginia not to take women's education seriously, including the failure to admit women to its flagship school, UVA, until 1972, and its subsequent decision to offer women opportunities that were conspicuously inferior to the opportunities available to men. We see a further bearing down on the historical and structural nature of sex discrimination in her dissenting opinion 11 years later in Gonzalez versus Carhart, a case that upheld Congress's ban on so-called partial birth abortion. In the dissent, there is again no suggestion that sex equality is unintentional or accidental. Instead, anti-abortion laws like the one at issue in Carhart are cast as part of a contested battle over the control of women's lives, laws which in purpose as well as in effect subordinate women's rights to political interests. She points out that the term partial birth abortion is itself a political term, that the underlying medical assertions on which the law was based lacked any substantial medical authority, and that the so-called moral concerns expressed in the case were, quote, untethered to any ground genuinely serving the government's interest in preserving life. If Advocate Ginsburg's often focus on the fundamental sameness of men and women, her emphasis in Carhart and in a brief concurring opinion she writes 4 years ago in Women's Whole Life versus Hellerstedt is on the different realities of women's lives and the ways in which lawmakers use pretextual medical and moral arguments to try to maintain control over women's lives. The shifts I have mentioned could be seen as part of an evolution of her views on sex equality, but I think particularly in light of Professor Siegel's identification of some of these later arguments in her very early advocacy work, particularly in the pregnancy case in which she argued, I think it might be more accurate to say that Justice Ginsburg had a genius for determining what tools she needed in any given case to persuade others either to take her side of the case or, in the case of her famous dissents, to fight on for another day. Like the best of advocates and judges, she knew her audience and she knew her stuff. We're going to hear a lot tonight about the different aspects of her legacy, including her incredible determination to fight for what she most cared for. But knowing which argument to raise and when, knowing her stuff, for me, that's a big one. We go on now to Professor Dellinger.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for, I apologize for the delay. I'll just say 3 things about Justice Ginsburg. The first is implicit in what both Neil and Kate had to say about her, and that is her work before she became a justice. There are really only 2 justices in the era after Earl Warren stepped down in 1968, 69. There are only 2 justices who would have had a historical impact had they never become Supreme Court justices, and that is Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Ginsburg. In Marshall's case, his greatest contribution to the law came in his role as an advocate for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. In the case of Justice Ginsburg, it's a difficult balance to see where she had the greater impact, but her willingness to take on the litigation of these issues really helped shape America's consciousness. And she was a historic figure by the time she reached the Supreme Court. She must have been a wonderful advocate. I had the privilege of being opposing counsel to her in a moot court argument, which I don't know if I've ever seen a justice of the Supreme Court who was willing to be a moot court advocate, but she couldn't resist this particular challenge. It was done in honor of the 25th anniversary of the Women's Law Center. And it was to re-argue the case of Myra Bradwell versus the state of Illinois, where Myra Bradwell, the leading legal publisher of the era, challenged Illinois' limitation of the practice of law to men only. In the re-argument of the late 19th century case, Justice Ginsburg represented Myra Bradwell, and I had the dubious assignment of representing the state of Illinois and arguing vigorously that it was reasonable to limit the practice of law only to men. We had a distinguished panel of the Attorney General of the United States, Janet Reno, and other justices, but I was impressed with Neil would not have been surprised, having clerked for Justice Ginsburg, how intensely she prepared and how intensely she argued. As an advocate before Justice Ginsburg, she never raised her voice. Indeed, I found it often the case that I had to really pay maximum attention to hear what she was saying from the end of the bench in her soft voice. But in some ways that made it so much more powerful that she did not undertake to match the bravado of Justice Anthony Scalia, but she would be a quiet but persistent questioner with great intensity. And I know a bit about what she must have confronted when she undertook to become a professional lawyer. For someone born as she was in 1933, it's hard to imagine what an undertaking this was. My wife, who was born in 1940, in her 30s and became professors, tenured professors at the University of North Carolina. And I saw constantly the battles that she had to endure with people's skepticism about someone who was second or third in her class at Duke Law School, the skepticism she faced and fought through, the stereotypes she had to deal with, and it made me appreciate the fact that Ginsburg came even earlier to know what she did. And finally, I'd like to say a word about Martin Ginsburg. I was at a dinner of the National Women's Law Center for some now long forgotten award, but the main event of the evening was that it was the very first awarding of the Martin Abzug Supporting Spouse Award. Martin Abzug was the husband of longtime outspoken feminist Congresswoman Bella Abzug, and she had given this award in honor of her late husband, and we shared the dinner table with the Ginsburgs and with Representative Abzug. And Martin Ginsburg was extraordinary. Ruth Ginsburg says that he was the only guy around in law school that was interested in her mind as well as her other attributes. And he was steadfast in his support for and promotion of her career. When the seat was open for which she was a possible appointee, I did not know him, but he made an appointment to come by my office at the Department of Justice. He said he had concern. He had heard, and I think erroneously, that I was concerned about the position she had taken critiquing the opinion, not the result, but the opinion in Roe versus Wade. And he wanted to dispel that notion. And he spread out upon my desk a whole set of writings and speeches with yellow highlighted markers. And he made the argument that I was mistaken in my judgment on that score. I think he was indefatigable in his campaigning for Ruth Ginsburg and for the moral support that he provided throughout her career. I think that behind every successful woman, most often there's another successful woman, but occasionally there's another successful man, and Martin Abzug was such a man. I will just close by showing you, if any of you have not seen it, the cover of the New Yorker. It looks like this cover, and that's all it is. I think it is just a powerful reminder of the fact that Ruth Ginsburg will live on in our collective memory and continue to influence the shape and course of American culture. We'll now proceed to the next speaker.
Hi, I'm very pleased to be here. I'm Michael Dreeben, a student of Walter's, colleague of his now, former colleague of Neil Siegel, and friends with all of my co-panelists. And it's a real honor to be here to talk about Justice Ginsburg. I'm going to pick up right where Walter left off, Justice Ginsburg's legacy for the future, and I'm going to finish with that point too. But I want to start by painting the scene at the court on Saturday and Sunday after Justice Ginsburg died. I got the news, like many people, through an email that was a thunderbolt. It immediately triggered a deep sense of sadness and grieving, and my phone lit up with people who are sobbing, people who had been close to the justice, people who had not been close to the justice, and were in shock and disbelief. And I felt a strong need to go down to the court to just be there. So my wife and I got some flowers and went to the court, and we were far from the only ones that had that idea. It was a beautiful, crisp day, clear blue sky, and there were hundreds of people surrounding the court who had brought flowers, hand-drawn pictures of the justice, quotes from her opinions, quotes about her life. There were mothers with young daughters, far too young to understand who Justice Ginsburg was, who wanted their daughters to be there and see the scene. And the solemnity, the sense of appreciation, gratitude, and determination helped me pull up from the sadness that I was feeling to see how deeply she had touched so many people with her, and I'm going to use one of her favorite words, path-marking work in bringing about gender equality. So I want to talk a little bit about my experiences arguing in front of Justice Ginsburg. She was a quiet, non-inflammatory justice in my experience, with a definite bent for the practical. One of the first cases that I argued in front of her was about whether women were protected against discriminatory peremptory challenges in the jury selection process. And we argued yes, that they were. All of our authority was built on cases that she had advocated and won before joining the judiciary. And I was citing all of those cases, and I could see her smiling, but she didn't say a word until I was getting hammered by people who said, well, wouldn't this be incredibly impractical? And she bailed me out by saying, yes, but isn't this already the rule in several federal circuits in several states? And she gave me a little bit of a smile. I took the lifeline and I escaped intact. In a later case that I argued, a securities fraud case, she was pretty clearly on my side from the way that she looked at me, and she ended up writing the opinion. It was a little bit of a surprise that the government won. And she bailed me out of a critique that the dissent had launched that I had a little bit over-argued my case. And she did acknowledge that the dissent caught me in an overstatement. But then she finished by saying that all the government had done was press a solid point too far, something lawyers and occasionally even judges are wont to do. It was the most gentle letdown that you could imagine. I want to turn to her personal kindness. Justice Ginsburg not only had this incredible persona and this love of opera and culture and good food cooked by her husband, and wine, which occasionally caused her to doze off during the State of the Union, probably to her benefit. But she also, behind the scenes, was ever ready to inscribe books. She inscribed the cookbook for her husband, Marty, for my sister on the occasion of her birthday. She signed opinions for people in the Solicitor General's office when she had written the opinion. Did all of this very freely. I've talked to many friends who said they barely knew her, but she found out that there was a problem in their family. She would offer to help, call hospitals to get people admitted. She did all of that while being the most productive and hardworking of justices and a true professional judge. In a lot of big cases, the justices tune out when the next case comes along and it's about civil procedure or bankruptcy or some other topic that is less headline grabbing. Not Justice Ginsburg. She would just move the books aside, open up the next case, and get right down to work. And it was that combination of idealism and practicality that I think made her such a great advocate. So let me finish by talking about her indomitable spirit with a couple of quotes from the justice that have appeared in the paper, but I think that they add up to a very important picture. She was quoted as saying, "Anger and envy are wasted emotions. They simply zap your energy and waste time." I love her use of the word zap there. When she was asked by a group of admirers for advice, she said, "My advice is to fight for the things you care about, but to do it in a way that will lead others to join you." And then my personal favorite, which I have seen quoted, but also heard said live and practice frequently, and so does my wife, quote, "Sometimes in a marriage, it helps to be a little deaf." I think all of that attests to her sly sense of humor, her practicality, and her wisdom. She said in her oral dissent in Shelby County versus Holder, a voting rights case that greatly retrenched on the ability of the federal government to police against voting abuses in certain states, quoting Martin Luther King, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And then she added, "If there is steadfast commitment to see the task through to completion." I think that sums up Justice Ginsburg's life's work and is something that I hope I can take with me through the grief and the mourning and apply to continue to carry on the work, the building a better moral universe, tikkun olam in Jewish tradition, and to have that steadfast commitment that she manifested through her life and her work. Thank you. And I will turn it over to our next.
Hi, everyone. It's a privilege to be here with all of you tonight, virtually at least, to get a chance to reflect at least a little bit more on Justice Ginsburg's amazing life and legacy. I didn't know the justice personally, but I did meet her once in 2003 when I was clerking for Justice Stevens, and she invited me and my co-clerks to tea in her chambers. We were all pretty seriously nervous about it. I don't think she was known as notorious RBG quite yet, but she was Justice Ginsburg, and we were all completely in awe of her. So, we filed in kind of awkwardly and we sat down, and she served us tea and biscotti on very lovely china. And then she made a point of telling us that her husband Marty had baked that biscotti, indeed that he did all the cooking. And I remember being really struck by that. First, I realized to my shame that if she hadn't said that, I probably would have assumed that she'd done the baking, though it's quite unlikely that I would have made the same assumption if Justice Stevens had handed me a cookie from home. But that expectation was there in my subconscious, I realized. Not enough that she's a Supreme Court justice, right? But she needs to do the cooking too. But it was also this small and powerful reminder of who she was and everything she stood for, how she, more than any other single person, had advanced the cause of equality for women, not just in the workplace, but also in the home. And that moment in her chambers has come back to me many times over the years. And it was in my head yesterday as I was thinking about this event and read that Helen Reddy had just died. So Helen Reddy wrote and sang the early 70s anthem, I Am Woman. I'm guessing most of you don't know this song, but you might still know its first line, which is, I am woman, hear me roar. So it's kind of a folksy, almost like easy listening 70s song, but it has this powerful chorus. I am strong, I am invincible, I am woman. And it was a big hit, but it was criticized at the time for being anti-man, which of course it was not. And that ties in with the big theme of Justice Ginsburg's work, both her work as a justice, but even more so her work as a lawyer. When she was running the litigation campaign for the ACLU that Dean Abrams and Professors Bartlett and Dellinger both spoke about. I teach the story of that litigation campaign in my class on judicial decision making. And one of the things that always jumps out to me about it, and I think jumps out to many of the students as well, is how many of her plaintiffs were men, as Professor Bartlett mentioned. Now, there were a number of strategic reasons for that choice, but as Justice Ginsburg later explained, one was to show the justices how even seemingly benign classifications based on stereotypes, like stereotypes about breadwinning men and dependent caregiving women, could work as a kind of double-edged discrimination that hurt not only women, but also men. And in addition to driving home the point that Professor Bartlett mentioned, that we all have rights to be treated as individuals and not as generalizations, the point also helps chip away at the notion that equality is this zero-sum game, that elevating one group means pushing down another, or if women are roaring, then men must be silenced. I doubt Marty Ginsburg ever felt silenced as his wife was roaring so loudly. So meanwhile, at about the same time this week, my 9-year-old daughter, who has the I Dissent book by her bedside, started complaining about gender stereotypes, which I gather she was talking about in school. So she says, you know, why does everyone assume I like pink? I like black. And with all these thoughts of RBG swimming around in my head, all I could think was how this little girl is living in such a different world because of Justice Ginsburg. But so is my son, who's 7 and who does like pink. We all are. Doors are open to all of us that would not have been open, but for the work of this strong, invincible woman. Thanks to all of you for being here with us tonight to honor her.
Hi, thank you guys for being here and for letting me speak at this. As Christine mentioned earlier, this past February, Duke had the honor to have Justice Ginsburg speak at an event celebrating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and the fact that for the first time ever, as far as we're aware, the editors-in-chief of the top 16 law reviews in the country were all women. Justice Ginsburg spoke at this event and it meant the world to the 16 of us. I spent this week talking and catching up with those 16 women, and I wanted to share some of their thoughts and takeaways reflecting back on that event several months later now. There were really 2 buckets that people were thinking about when they were thinking back about this event. The first was Justice Ginsburg's perseverance, and the second was her general presence and her commitment to being present. So for the first thing, her perseverance, I think that's something that, looking at what everyone's been saying at this event, is very clear. Obviously, she's someone who worked very hard, but what stood out to us was how different the world was when she had to work as hard as she did. As you've heard, she had to go through law school at a time when women weren't really going through law school. She was the only woman on her law review. There's the story about her dean asking her why she was at the school taking away a spot from a man. All of those events made one of my fellow EICs from last year say, you know, it makes us realize how terribly privileged we are. We're not just able to go to law school, but we're able to be on law review, be editors-in-chief of law reviews without really giving it much of a second thought. And that's something that wasn't necessarily true all of those years ago. But as we also know, that's not the only kind of hardship that Justice Ginsburg has had to go through. She's faced unspeakable hardships, some of which we know, and some of which the vast majority of us will never know. And there's something that we kept coming back to as we've been talking over the last week. That is, there's something truly inspiring about someone walking on a tightrope, but making it look as if they're walking on solid ground. The second sort of bucket of reflections that we had looking back at the event was about Justice Ginsburg's presence. It took all of us by surprise to actually hear that Justice Ginsburg was going to attend the event. I mean, after all, she's a Supreme Court justice. She's probably horribly busy, but also had her own personal life to think about, her own health, her own family. And yet she carved out that time to be with us on that day. And that meant so much to us. At that time, she knew how much she meant to us, and she took the time to be there because she knew it would mean so much to us. I know that for all of us, that is something we will never forget, because for a lot of us, we went to law school because we viewed Justice Ginsburg as an absolute idol. And Justice Ginsburg knew that at the end of the day, it's impossible to stand on the shoulder of giants if they aren't available for others to stand on their shoulders. And that'll be something that we think about forever. So we were incredibly, incredibly grateful for Duke and for Justice Ginsburg for speaking there. And it's something that for sure is going to live on in our memories, in my memory at least, for a very long time. I'll turn it over to Professor Griffin.
In thinking about how to close this event, I considered why Justice Ginsburg's passing has been so deeply meaningful to so many people, including all of you here tonight. For lawyers everywhere, it is especially heartbreaking because she was the very essence of the things we most treasure: excellence, equality, fairness. For women, especially young women, for my daughters, for my students, she was a model of grit and greatness, a tiny woman in gloves and lace collars who became an intergenerational pop culture icon and a symbol of intellect and strength. She blocked headwinds for us. She stood up for us. She gave all of us freedom, ambition, and the inspiration to be whoever we are and do our best work in our chosen profession. And she taught us lessons about what to do with that freedom and whatever power and privilege might come with it. At a moment that feels destabilizing in our national discourse, it is an especially acute loss. She believed in building things rather than tearing them down. And she chose her words with exquisite care and always moved in a deliberate way. I have been thinking also about her relationship with Justice O'Connor, for whom I clerked. Though they were very different people, they had the same core of steely determination and true optimism. Justice Ginsburg was even optimistic when she felt compelled to write vigorous dissents, describing them as messages to the future and keeping her eye on a later time and a better day. Justice O'Connor was likewise entirely without grievance and relentlessly forward-looking. Neither of them ever let adversity define them, even though they both experienced plenty of it. Together, they formed the first generation of women at the Supreme Court. They already admired each other when Justice Ginsburg was nominated. In fact, Justice O'Connor had hired more clerks from Judge Ginsburg on the DC Circuit than from any other judge. Justice O'Connor was then a guide during Justice Ginsburg's early days at the court, and Justice Ginsburg once called her the most helpful big sister that anyone could have. They treasured each other as fellow pioneers, joked about the advocates who would mix them up during oral arguments, and had an affectionate and appreciative relationship. They were both very humble, but they understood the importance of their visibility in their positions too. And even when they disagreed, they warmly supported each other as colleagues and compatriots. Whenever they could, they lifted each other up. Perhaps Justice Ginsburg's most significant opinion, mentioned several times tonight, was in the VMI decision rejecting the exclusion of women from the Virginia Military Institute. That opinion was originally assigned to Justice O'Connor to write, and she turned it down, saying, "This should be Ruth's." It was after Justice O'Connor left the court that Justice Ginsburg began writing more and perhaps louder dissents and reading them from the bench in a way that later made her notorious. For those few years, she was once again the lone woman on that high bench. But she was not alone there for long, and she will never be alone now. Millions and millions of people will not forget her and have learned from her example. We can honor her legacy by diligently pursuing excellence in our own work and firmly demanding equality for everyone. And maybe we can remember her best in smaller ways, by respecting the dignity and worth of each person we encounter anywhere, by supporting our colleagues and classmates, by caring for each other, and by staying optimistic about the days to come. Thank you for being here, and I think Naya has some closing words now.
On behalf of the Women's Law Students Association, I want to thank everyone for coming to this event. I want to especially thank the participants. We are so grateful that you all shared your reflections and your memories of Justice Ginsburg with us. We also want to thank the Dean's Office and the Program in Public Service for assisting with putting on this event. It was important to our organization that the Duke community come together to honor the legacy of Justice Ginsburg. Lastly, I want to close with just highlighting a fundraiser that is being conducted by If When How in honor of Justice Ginsburg. You can find more information about the fundraiser on the Duke's chapter, the Duke's If When How chapter's Instagram page. Thank you all for being here tonight. It really means a lot for us to just come together.